The disappointment of the American public and the world scientific community, and even to corporate giants like Goldman Sachs and Cargill, President Trump recently decided to withdraw the United States from the Paris Agreement. He cited as justification a slew of alternative facts. Some of the most egregious of these alternative facts came from a National Economic Resource Associates, a group we'll call NERA in this speech, a NERA report that was commissioned and promoted by a group that calls itself the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, but fronts for the fossil fuel industry. U.S. Chamber of Carbon might be a better and more accurate name for it. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce, so-called, is a heavy hitter in Washington. It was the second largest spender of anonymous outside money, or dark money, in the 2016 federal election, second only to the National Rifle Association. In addition to all that political election spending, it wields the largest lobbying force on Capitol Hill. In 2015, dropping over $100 million on lobbying. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce is one of climate action's most implacable enemies, as everybody here knows, despite the good climate policies of so many companies on its board. Along with Senators Warren and Sanders and others, I examined this inconsistency between the positions of the Chamber and of its board members in our recent report, The U.S. Chamber of Commerce Out of Step with the American People and its Members. I ask unanimous consent to enter that report into the record.
Without objection.
When President Trump announced his withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, he used these alternative facts from that chamber-commissioned NERA report. Here's what Trump said. Compliance with the terms of the Paris Accord and the onerous energy restrictions it has placed on the United States could cost America as much as 2.7 million lost jobs by 2025. This includes 440,000 fewer manufacturing jobs. And alternative facts, quote. This was another assertion. By 2040, compliance with the commitments put into place by the previous administration would cut production for the following sectors: paper down 12%, cement down 23%, iron and steel down 38%, coal, and I happen to love the coal miners, he said, down 86%, natural gas down 31%. The cost to the economy at this time would be close to $3 trillion in lost GDP and 6.5 million industrial jobs, while households would have $7,000 less income, and in many cases much worse than that. End quote of his alternative facts. Now, countless reviewers, including PolitiFact, Scientific American, that known crazy, phony liberal publication, Scientific American, CNBC, and Fortune magazine, fact-checked the president's speech. It did not fare well. PolitiFact warned us to take these statistics with a grain of salt. An analysis of the underlying report was done by Kenneth Gillingham, an economics professor at Yale University, and he pointed out that the NERA study made up a hypothetical set of policy actions to reach those goals. Those policy actions may well never have been taken by anyone to comply with the Paris Agreement, but that was what they used. Second, NERA only modeled the cost side. You heard the phrase cost-benefit equation? They only looked at the costs. They didn't ever look at the benefit side. This is phony accounting when you only look at one side of the ledger. Now, NERA, of course, has a history of producing misleading reports for its industry sponsors. In 2015, it released a report for the National Association of Manufacturers on the proposed ozone standard, claiming that it would cost as much as $140 billion per year. Well, on the cost side, EPA estimated it would cost a fraction of what NERA estimated, less than 12%. The economic consulting firm Synapse analyzed the NAM report and found it, quote, grossly overstates compliance costs due to major flaws, math errors, and unfounded assumptions. These assumptions and other flaws led NERA to overstate compliance costs by more than 700%. And that's just on the cost side. Once again, they didn't even bother to look at the benefits. It's a one-side-of-the-ledger phony analysis. So, of course, the Chamber commissioned NERA to do the same thing for it on climate: overestimate the costs and ignore the benefits. In this world of climate denial, this is a classic maneuver. Senator Ted Cruz cited the NERA report in his CNN op-ed urging President Trump to pull the U.S. out of the Paris Agreement a day before President Trump cited these stats in his withdrawal speech. Cruz, Trump, and the Chamber ignored more than 1,000 companies that supported the U.S. remaining in the Paris Agreement, including several Chamber member companies. Some of these have publicly distanced themselves from the Chamber as a result of the president's decision. A recent Bloomberg News article was headlined, "Paris Pullout Pits Chamber Against Some of Its Biggest Members." Citigroup said, "We have been outspoken in our support for the Paris Agreement and have had a dialogue with the Chamber about how its views and advocacy on climate policy are inconsistent with Citi's position." Similar distancing came from Dow and Ford. Over the weekend, the Washington Post ran a piece, "Is the most powerful lobbyist in Washington," that's the so-called U.S. Chamber of Commerce, "losing its grip?" exploring this tension around climate in more detail. The article said perhaps the most nettlesome issue for the Chamber has been climate change. It calls out the Chamber's claims to be neutral on the Paris Agreement while actually providing, quote, ammunition for foes of the agreement. The article highlights the Chamber's climate denial efforts, including its 2009 proposal to hold a public trial on climate science, what it dubbed the Scopes monkey trial of the 21st century. New Mexico-based utility P&M Resources actually quit the Chamber because that idea was so preposterous. Washington Post identified 8 of the 25 companies that signed an ad in the New York Times supporting the Paris Agreement as Chamber members, including GE, Microsoft, and Walt Disney. The CEOs of these companies publicly criticized President Trump's decision. Microsoft's Brad Smith said, "We're disappointed with the decision to exit the Paris Agreement. Microsoft remains committed to doing our part to achieve its goals." GE's Jeff Immelt said, "Disappointed with today's decision on the Paris Agreement. Climate change is real. Industry must now lead and not depend on government." Walt Disney's Bob Iger said, "As a matter of principle, I've resigned from the President's counsel over the Paris Agreement withdrawal." The Chamber is out of step with its own members on climate change, maintaining a scientifically untenable position, as every one of our home state universities, our state universities, knows. So who is pulling the Chamber's chain? Well, it's hard to tell since the Chamber hides from the public who its donors are, but I suspect the answer is the same as why the Republicans continue to revive the hated zombie health care bill despite huge public distaste for it. Which brings me to the nomination of John Bush to be the United States Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit. The Chamber's rigid anti-climate stance is part of a fossil fuel political program that holds this chamber in a state of intimidation and inaction on climate change. As Congress cowers before this fossil fuel political presence, we are now advancing the nomination of a climate denier to the federal bench. John Bush was not nominated because of any track record of distinguished performance or demonstrated commitment to public service. To the contrary, his most notable achievement seemed to be a series of wildly offensive blog postings and public statements, denying that climate change is real and mocking it, comparing a woman's right to choose to the evil of slavery, casually using vile slurs against gay people, and on go the list. Bush has written a number of posts dealing with environmental issues in which he insists on placing the terms global warming and climate change in quotation marks, insinuating that they do not really exist. Tell that to your home state universities. So, with this appalling track record, why was he nominated? It is not hard to figure that out. He is here because, through those offensive blog posts, and by flagging himself as a loyal climate denier, he signals himself as a willing foot soldier of the big special interests. These big special interests are intent on capturing our courts, just as they have captured so much of Congress. Judicial nominees like Mr. Bush are exactly what these special interests want, to make sure that they can first maintain their dark money influence. That is their most particular key. That is the mothership off of which all the other special interest mischief that they perform comes from. And of course, to see to it that these big interests are never held accountable to the American people. That's the signal that he sends. Bush has flagged that he will rule the right way for the big special interests that fund the Republican Party. And his nomination and confirmation is those special interests' big reward. He has shown that he's familiar with the recipes when it comes time to cook the decisions. My Democratic colleagues and I respect any president's desire and prerogative to fill the vacancies in the executive and judicial branches. Even though I understand we won't see eye to eye with our colleagues across the aisle on every nominee, Senate Democrats have given the president's nominees a very fair shake. But this is no normal nominee. This is a freak who lowers the bar on judicial nominees forever. If Mr. Bush wants to exercise his First Amendment right to spout offensive, ignorant, and hateful nonsense as some kind of nutty Breitbart blogger, he is free to do so. But that is not the measure, or has not until today been the measure, of a federal judge for the United States Court of Appeals. Mr. Bush is patently unqualified for this position, well outside any version of the mainstream, and his appointment can reasonably be predicted to bring dishonor and preordained partiality to the judiciary. I regret that we are at this point, and I yield the floor.